All right, I think we should probably get started. Okay. So, hi, I'm Aven.
I'm Mark.
And this is The Endless Knot, a podcast about language, history, and the unexpected connections between them. It's a small version of our normal opening. So, today what we've thought we'd do is try to give you a little taste of our podcast. We're going to try to give you a bit of a taste of our podcast and what we do with it, and we're going to do that by exploring some of the stories behind words for colors in English. Now, before we start, however, there's one very important part that is part of our podcast ritual, and we just wouldn't feel right recording a podcast without it. So, we brought our equipment. These are our camping cocktail glasses because you all have camping cocktail glasses, right?
Now we're committed to cocktails and we have a special set of glasses for camping.
So when we have our podcast, we just sit in our basement and we record, and we always start with a cocktail that's appropriate to whatever we're talking about. So today we're going to talk about colors. So we have produced something very classy. We have a high-class cocktail in a water bottle. We flew down from Canada and didn't want to bring alcohol, so we bought some as soon as we got in the city, got in the cab and asked to be driven to the nearest liquor store. Where we picked up some blue curacao and some gin. And this cocktail is called a Blue Moon. I like gin, so it's quite a high quality local Massachusetts gin, which I've forgotten the name of, and a really, really low quality blue curacao, which is totally ruined the gin. So, we feel that this will keep us going. So, cheers.
Cheers.
Sorry, we're not sharing. There's quite probably some licensing issue if we did. So, what we're going to do is we're going to start moving through words for colors. And we're going to explain their etymologies, or Mark will explain their etymologies. A few fun facts about their symbolism and cultural associations in ancient Greece and Rome and the Middle Ages. That's because I'm a classicist, and Mark is a medievalist, so those are the bits of things we can talk about. And the order we're going to do that is based on a sort of linguistic fact about color.
Yeah, this comes from some research done by a couple of scholars in the late 1960s, Brent Berlin and Paul Kay, and they did a cross-cultural study of color terms, and discovered that it's not random that what colors are covered in a language. Not all languages have divided the spectrum in the same way, but it's not just random in the way that they do divide up the spectrum. There is a hierarchical pattern that you see. So if a language has, all languages have at least a color or a word for dark or black, and a color for bright or white. Now, if a language has 3 words for colors, then they will have black and white and red. And if a language has 4, then it'll be either green or yellow. 5, then both green and yellow. And then, that you have blue, brown, and then everything else.
And that's basic color words. So you might have a word for, flower that is a particular color, and you might have that word in your language, but if your language has a word that isn't for a thing, but is a color, this is sort of the order. There's a little controversy of exactly how schematic it is, and maybe this isn't quite as true as Berlin and Kay thought it was. Yeah. But it roughly speaking does hold true for most languages around the world. So what we're going to do is move through the colors in that order: black, white, red, and we'll go through. Depending on the time and how long we spend on digressions, at some point we will skip to the end.
But not get all the colors.
We may leave some of the colors out, but as you can tell, not all languages have all the color words, so clearly won't equally. So the other element that Berlin and Kay are talking about hue, that is, the wavelength of light we might talk about of a particular color. But there's other ways of describing colors and other elements of a colorful thing that might be important to you. For instance, luster, whether they're shiny or matte. How brilliant or sparkling do they, does the light reflect off it or not? That's an element of color, and that could be very important. And also saturation, how intense a color is, if it's a very light color or a very dark color. And not all cultures are as interested in hue as we tend to be when you learn color words as a kid, you learn hues. We have a rainbow spectrum, that's what we think in. But many other languages are more interested in how shiny things are. In fact, we'll get to that. Shiny, big deal, because a lot of people are very concerned about shininess. And one of the things that we'll talk about as we go through is how, when you look back at some of the etymologies of these words, you realize that, in particular, this is a particular topic with the ancient Greeks, their concern was much less for exactly where on the spectrum the colors fall, but much more how reflective, how shiny, how bright or intense a color was. And that's how they tended to group colors. So we'll also talk about that as we go through. So let's start off with white.
With white. Well, let's start with the word white. It comes through Old English, so the Old English word wheat, it's pretty much the same. And it meant white or clear or fair or beautiful, so it had, figurative senses as well as the literal denotation of the color white. And it can be traced back further to what's called the Proto-Indo-European language, which is a hypothetical reconstruction of the parent language of a whole bunch of languages spoken in places like Europe and in India, as far away as India, and various places like that. And so that root that you can trace it back to, that hypothetical root, is quate. Sounds pretty similar, I suppose, in a way. And in the sort of reconstructed meaning of that root is either white or to shine. So there's our first shiny word, right?
Count the shiny words.
Now, the really surprising thing about all of this is that that root doesn't only come once into English. It produces a number of other related words that can all be traced back to that same root. Perhaps the most important of which is the word wheat. So white and wheat, they sound pretty similar, and indeed can be traced back. Wheat also comes through Old English. Huata is the Old English form of wheat. And it's called that because wheat is the white or light-colored grain, or it produces the white, light-colored flour when you milled that grain. And in fact, if you look at other words that mean something along the lines of light-colored or bright in Proto-Indo-European, if you look for other roots, there are some others. Also, quite a few of them, quite a few words for bright or shiny. So we will see some of those, not necessarily all of them, but there were quite a few of them. Now, some of the other related words, some of the other words for white that I will mention that come into English in a different path is the Proto-Indo-European root albo. It meant white, something along the lines of white or bright in Proto-Indo-European, but it makes it into Latin as albus, like Albus Dumbledore, a white wizard, I guess you could say. And that does make it into modern English as words like albino. That seems fairly logical. Albumen, which is the white part of an egg. But also the word album, which you might at first wonder, well, what's the connection between an album? I mean, if you're thinking records, they're kind of black-colored, really. The explanation there is that the word album used to refer to the album amicorum. And basically, it was like a signature book, right? It initially started off as a blank page at the end of your Bible, and you'd have your professors write their names there, and that would be sort of like your CV. These are the people I've learned from. And then eventually it just became blank books that you could collect signatures in. So that was sort of the idea of it being a blank page. And eventually that was applied to photo albums or scrap albums. And then record albums were collections of discs put together in a big sleeve, and it kind of looked like a photo album. So that's how we get the modern word.
You have to know. You have to know what a record album is. Some of you might know that's an ancient term too. That's ancient history too. But yeah, record. I know. We'll have that. That's a second conversation we'll have later for your young ones.
And we get a number of other words. Elf, auburn, which we think of as brown now, but probably because the word auburn sounded a little bit like brown, and so now it refers to more of a brown color, but originally it was more sort of blonde hair. There's also the root pel in Proto-Indo-European, from which you get pale. That makes sense, I suppose. Pale, pallid, appall, which means to grow pale. Falcon, because it was a gray bird. And we get the word polio from poliomyelitis. It referred to the gray marrow, so that's where that disease it affects. It's an inflammation of the gray matter in the spinal cord, basically. So, and the final one I'll mention is cand, which meant to shine again in Proto-Indo-European, and it makes it into Latin as candidus, meaning white, and from that we get candidate because the Roman senators, when they were running for office, wore white togas.
Extra white.
Extra white togas. Bleached white togas.
Well,
or chalk white.
Imbued with chalk dust
chalk
so that they would
togas.
be shiny. No, bright, not shiny.
Bright.
Sorry.
And candor and candid, because that's metaphorically, clear. And candle, that makes sense too.
All right, so that's sort of a bunch of words, and several of those are Latin words. Sometimes I would talk about some of the other Latin words, but we're trying to keep this short. We'll probably fail at that, but that's okay. So I was just going to talk quickly about some ancient associations of white that might be a little surprising. Some of them are fairly obvious that are similar now. These are broadly true of Greek, some of them, but I'm going to focus on Roman for the moment. That usually happens because that's more of my specialty. So there are kind of two kinds of white in the ancient Roman world. There's shining white, and that's a good thing, and there's matte or pallid white, and that's a bad thing. So candidus, which he mentioned, is shining white, and it's always good. It's beautiful. It can mean beautiful metaphorically, and it's fortunate and lucky, and a white day is a lucky day, a fortunate day in the calendar. You mark it as white, with a white petal or white instead of a black one. So candidus is, and the beloved of a poet is always candidus, pale, and that I'll get back to in a moment. On the other hand, at least in a man, pallor or white skin is sickness, death, disease, illness. So the word pallidus specifically refers to the kind of pallor that comes on you when you're sick. And so that kind of whiteness, and bodily whiteness in particular, is associated with illness and is a bad thing. And can also specifically be associated with the lovesick lover. So the lover is pallidus because he's sick and sickly, but the beloved is candidus because she or he is beautiful and brilliant. So they're both sort of unusually white, but in different ways. Now another association is white can be associated with old age, and that probably shouldn't be surprising because of the white hair of old age. But white can also mean unripe in the sense we use green to mean. So green grapes are often referred to as white grapes or white olives. That's in Greek in particular. Green, what we would call green olives are white olives. So you have this odd, it can mean unripe and very young, but it can also mean very old. And all of these terms get used in these metaphorical ways. I work a lot on poetry, so in particular in poetry, but in other contexts too. And then finally, white skin in particular is a feminine quality. So is associated with women as being untanned, it's not going outside. So you have fairly, really strong associations when you look at certain kinds of Greek vase art where women are depicted as white-skinned and men are depicted as black-skinned, those being the two colors that they're working within. But it also can be barbaric, because for the Romans, and to a certain extent the Greeks, the weird northern people who were clearly frozen by the frost, this is a very Roman way of thinking of them, were bleached pale and were bloodless because they just didn't have enough blood, and that's why they were so weird and blonde and white. So, there's a wide range there, and sometimes it's different terminology that's used, but sometimes you can use the same words for different kinds. It depends on the context, really. So that's just a quick sprinkling of some Roman associations. And the medieval...
I won't go into them too much because they're pretty much the same ones that we have. Purity, and we have wedding dresses that are white, though that wasn't the default color always for a wedding dress until into the 19th century. But nevertheless, generally speaking, white suggested purity. But one slightly surprising one, in medieval France, it was the color of mourning. So if you were, grieving, you might wear white, which is very different for us.
It still is in Hinduism, so widows wear white in India. All right, so that's
Black.
white. Black.
So the word black itself, it comes through Old English, black, pronounced exactly the same way, and can be traced back to one of those Proto-Indo-European roots, bel, which meant to shine. That may seem surprising at first, to shine, flash, or burn, and that's the key. It produced a number of words that meant shining white and various bright colors. So it does seem a little bit strange that we might get the word black from that. And the explanation for this is that it's that burning idea. So it could be used to refer to the color of fire, but it could also be used to refer to the color of the coal or the soot. So it's that sense of the burning, burnt, in other words, a burnt or sooty color, that leads to the color of black. Now there was a separate Old English word, block, as opposed to black, which actually meant bright, shining, or glittering. So with that slight difference in vowel quality, you could be referring to something that's soot-colored or that's shining and bright and fiery, perhaps. And so if you look at the cognate words in English that come from that same root, a lot of them are words that we would associate with white color, like bleach. Bleach is cognate with black. Blonde. Blonde hair is fair colored hair. Blind, blush, and what we'll get back to, blue, surprisingly. So this one root has produced words that mean black, white, and blue, which is quite a lot for one root to do. That blue color comes in through the Germanic branch. The word flame is also related to this. That comes in through Latin flamma. And the word blanch, to turn white, that comes through French, blanc, white. Though it's not a Latin word, it is in fact a Germanic word that was borrowed into Old French from the Frankish language, which is a Germanic language. So there's a fair amount of vocabulary in French that has come from actually a Germanic source, even though it's mainly a language derived from Latin. Now, black was not the normal word for the color black in Old English. The more common word is actually swart, from which we get the word swarthy. And so that's much more common in Old English if you really want to refer to that color. It can be traced back to another one of those Proto-Indo-European roots, swarto, which meant black or dirty. And it's also the source of the word sordid through Latin. So that root goes into Latin and gives us the word sordid, which is, you get that kind of dirty sense from that.
Okay. That we're already done 20 minutes, so I don't know how many of these colors we're getting.
Yeah.
Just thought I'd point that out. But, all right, black, very quickly, some not at all surprising connotations in the ancient world. But again, there's a bit of a distinction between matte black and shining black, though it's not always a clear-cut distinction. So the matte black is dirty and gray, and it's the underworld, and it's death. So that's pretty straightforward. There's also black blood, so blood is often referred to as black, but there's a not totally consistent but quite common distinction between blood can be black or it can be red. It's black when it's outside of the body and when you're dying from the wound, basically. So blood that's been spilled is black, blood in the body is red. Not totally, not in every kind of context, certainly seas are red with blood and things like that, but and this actually is more common in Homeric Greek contexts, and it becomes a little muddied later on. But blood in the body is red, and maybe we'll get to that in just a moment, and because you're alive with it. So those are sort of the basic ideas of black. As I mentioned already, white skin is feminine, black skin is masculine in that context, black meaning anything dark. And just one little relevance to that is, for instance, when Athena takes off the old beggar costume from Odysseus in the Odyssey and says, let me return you to your beautiful, brilliant state, turn you into a great hero so that you can walk into your hall and look beautiful again, she makes his hair curly like hyacinths and turns his skin black, like blackens his skin and makes him beautiful again. So we see there a word for darkness because he's a manly hero who goes out and spends all his time outside, so of course he's dark-skinned. So we have black Odysseus there. And though we started with black and white, and they can be opposites, black is not always opposed to white. White is paired with a lot of other colors as its opposite more often in the ancient world. So we'd be real quick for red.
Well, in terms of color associations with the clothing of peasants originally, but when you get to the Renaissance period, it actually then becomes the color of nobility. So that's an interesting shift that happened there. In around the year 1200, Pope Innocent III declared that black should be the color of penance and mourning. So that's when that dates to. And I think that's all I'll say about black.
All right, it's red.
Red. We'll order through red here.
Yeah.
So
I think that might be as far as we get.
So,
at least you blue.
Yeah, okay, we'll skip to blue at the end.
blue, yeah. So the word red comes from Old English rad, traced back to a Proto-Indo-European root red, which meant red or ruddy in color. And it's cognate with the word ruddy and rust through Germanic, ruby and rouge from Latin rubeus, red, and robust, surprisingly, through Latin robur, which actually referred specifically to the red oak, so a specific species of tree, and that's why robust has this strong sense to it, because an oak tree is a very strong tree, very strong wood. We also get the word rubric from that red root, through the Latin ruber, because of the red lettering used in medieval manuscripts. This is where we get the expression red letter day. So if there was a particularly important holy day, you might mark it with red ink so it stands out against all the rest of the black ink. And you would also use red ink to mark the sections in a manuscript, so kind of like chapter headings, basically. And so one of the other ways that you might mark those section divisions in a medieval manuscript is with a decorated large letter, a large initial capital letter, basically. And you draw a little painting, usually they could be little figures or animals in the letter. And we get the word miniature from this process because the Latin word minium referred to a kind of pigment, red lead, basically. And it produced a little picture, so that capital letter came to be referred to in Italian as miniatura. And that came into English with the sense of a little picture. And so now, because it sounds a little bit similar to words like minimum or minute, we think that miniature, the thing that's being drawn attention to there is the small size. But in fact, it didn't originally have anything to do with the small size. It was a reference to this, the ink, basically.
So I'm gonna cut you off. About, when we do this at home, I can edit.
Me out.
But so just talk a little bit about red, because I just want to highlight one particular combination and an important color of red in the ancient world. There's obvious things like blood and war and stuff like that. But red and white are a really important combination, especially in Roman, but also in Greek thought. That is an erotic combination. So the combination of red and white has to do with, is beautiful, but in a sexual way. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The white skin of the feminine or the effeminized boy, the young boy, who is also not yet darkened skin and therefore is attractive and beautiful, because of course young boys, young meaning, well, we'll get into that, are also objects of erotic desire. And so white skin, and then the red of the blush that shows their youthfulness and also their lovely sense of shame and modesty, because of course, so there's a very famous blush, for instance, Lavinia blushes in the Aeneid. She never speaks a word, but she does blush once, and because somebody mentions marriage near her, mentions her marriage, so she blushes, and this is this moment of like great eroticism, and it drives her would-be husband mad with jealousy and goes off and starts war, because it's always a woman's fault. So blood, but there's also a more direct combination of white skin and the blood of defloration, the hymen blood. So the blood of the white, against the white skin of the maiden is a combination that's very connected with weddings and young women just about to get married or just getting married, and then also associated with death. So there's this weird erotic thing about young deaths, beautiful men dying in battle and lying on the battlefield with their red blood across them, and on how beautiful and erotic they are, and also dead. Now, I think it's particularly in Virgil, but it's elsewhere too. And then sometimes young women who die, there's a particularly famous one in the Antigone by Sophocles, where the young woman dies and blood spills across her, and she dies instead of getting married. So she's there dead with the combination that looks like it should be erotic, but she's actually dead, and so this instead of getting married. So this is a really like resonant color combination. I wouldn't say it's more important than white and black necessarily, but that red and white combination comes up in all sorts of contexts, and whenever it does, it means more than just, oh, there's two colors. It always has this other sort of strong combination. And blushes and lips and things like that. So do we want to skip to blue, because we can't not do blue? It's
If you want blue, we can do blue.
ironically,
I want blue.
okay, very quickly. I think we have possibly the least to say about blue.
So that's good. Well, the word blue itself, as I said, comes from the same root as black. It comes, in fact, through Old French from a Germanic root. So this is another one of these Germanic borrowings into Old French. And it had an early sense of pale or livid, the color of bruised skin, basically. And so I guess it's kind of through that sort of sense that we get the tone of blue, but it's not very clear for a long time that blue really meant blue as we think of it now. So this is one of these ones that was kind of
It's
vague
later
for a
on the
while.
Berlin and K scale, and
Yeah.
we don't have a good word for blue until quite late in the development of English.
And in fact, there was no word for blue in Proto-Indo-European. Proto-Indo-European had four basic color terms. There were other words that were sort of colorish, but four basic color terms, which were black, white, red, and yellow. So green, for instance, just means grow. It's the same root that we get grow from, so it just refers to plants because the color of plants is green. So by the time you get to blue, there's not a clear color for blue in Proto-Indo-European. So what comes into English, has had some kind of a sense shift over its history.
And the words that we do have what they do have in the ancient world and the medieval world is words for things that are blue. So later in the medieval in particular, you get lapis lazuli words, a whole bunch of words that come from the stone lapis lazuli, and we don't have time to enumerate them, but it's like the word gets shifted over and over again into some form of word for blue. Indigo because of the dye, turquoise because of the stone. On that note, there is a long-standing sort of thing in classics that in the 19th century that the ancient Greeks could not see blue. This was an early anthropological thing because Homer never uses a word for blue in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and that the Homeric Greeks couldn't see, the sky is blue and the sea is blue, and if Homer never calls them blue, they clearly couldn't see blue, and this was actually worked into a sort of early Darwinian, picking up the idea. This was around the time they were working out Proto-Indo-European, and evolution was a big deal. Clearly the Homeric Greeks couldn't see blue, and then they evolved the ability to see blue around when poets started mentioning blue things in their poems. And that's not true, but it is true that there are no clear words for blue in the ancient world. But there's some linguistic things and anthropological things that make sense. What it seems to be is that blue was not a word that they bothered telling you. They didn't. So in Homer, the sea is shining in various different ways. It's luster and it's reflectiveness that matters. And the sky, you never mention when it's blue, but you do mention if it's cloudy, and you do mention if it's rosy, because those are things that are not normal, or that tell you something. The sky's blue when the sky's blue, it's always blue. So you don't need to say it's blue, you say when it's dawn, or you say when it's cloudy and stormy and getting dark. So I just had to give you that because I wouldn't want at any point you to think that the Homeric Greeks couldn't see blue.
And the blue moon cocktail, by the way, blue moon didn't originally mean rare, it meant impossible. It was like saying, yeah, the moon's made of green cheese. It's not true. So you would say the moon is, blue. It's a way of saying it's not true. And it only later shifted to mean, well, it's something that only happens very rarely.
And I think we're going to end there because we've kept you too long. We've already gone over our time, so thank you very much. Cheers. now I got a light.
Questions?
Yeah, if you have questions, but I mean, we're over time, so that we will hang around in the hallway for a moment.
You're back over in
So much. And the podcast is called The Endless Knot, if that was
In the chapel.
Yes, and we've got some cards if you'd like some cards.
Why the name?
The Endless Knot?
Yeah.
It's a reference to the poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, in which he has as a personal symbol this five-pointed star like you can draw without lifting your pen from the page. And for him it was a sign of interconnectedness and
Are y'all
truth.
going to the
When we started the videos, which were about like the connections between things, so we went with connections. But yeah, so it's not a very descriptive title for the podcast, but it means something to us, but it means nothing to anybody else. And because we have the pentagram in our symbol, we do get a not insignificant number of people who think it's like a Wiccan podcast or something else like that. So it's a small flaw in our branding, but
Going somewhere next? Yeah, I'm going.
Yeah, I
back
wanna
to
go.
the Untitled Chapter.